Have you ever agreed to do something just to be polite, and then instantly regretted it? That's exactly what happened to me on my first day of residency. I thought giving a ride to a fellow intern would be a small act of kindness. But that single yes spiraled into weeks of awkward tension, subtle frustrations, and unexpected judgment. What started as a polite gesture became a daily test of my patience and personal boundaries, and I couldn't escape it. The morning was unusually still, as if the world had paused for a moment just for me. I stepped out of my apartment, coffee in hand, the first sip warming my chest, preparing me for the long drive ahead. The hospital was over an hour away, nestled in a quiet rural area where the fields stretched endlessly and the nearest gas station was a good 20 minutes from any intersection. The drive itself wasn't just a commute, it was a ritual. A buffer between my personal life and the intense world of residency that awaited me. I had rehearsed my first day countless times in my mind, the introductions, the faces, the hierarchy, the unspoken rules. And yet, nothing could have prepared me for the unexpected. A knock on my car window jolted me from my thoughts. I glanced to the side and saw a young man, perhaps my age, looking hesitant, yet hopeful, holding a small backpack as if it contained the weight of the world. "Hey," he said, voice tinged with nervousness. I heard you might live nearby. Do you think you could give me a ride to the hospital? Just for today, or whenever it's convenient." My stomach sank. Politeness screamed at me to say yes. The internal voice of caution whispered reasons to refuse. My time, my solitude, my carefully carved out morning sanctuary. But instinct and habit won over, and I nodded. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "I can take you today." Relief flooded his face. He slid into the passenger seat, muttering a quick thank you before settling in. At first, our conversation was cautious, polite, the kind of small talk that fills space but never touches anything real. His name, his department, the small talk about where we were from. I smiled, nodded, occasionally murmuring agreement, all while gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. The drive stretched, miles rolling by under the tires. I tried to focus on the audiobook I had queued up, letting the narrator's voice fill the quiet spaces between words, but the tension persisted like a shadow clinging to the edges of the car. This ride wasn't just about getting him to the hospital. It was about boundaries, politeness, and the invisible line between being nice and losing yourself. Then he started explaining his predicament. No car, long bus ride, hours wasted commuting. I nodded along, understanding, but also feeling the invisible weight of expectation. This isn't my problem, I reminded myself silently. I'm not obligated to solve this for him. By the time we reached the hospital, the building loomed large, imposing against the soft morning light. I exhaled, feeling the first taste of fatigue, not from the drive itself, but from the mental labor of being nice. He thanked me again, and I offered another polite smile. Just today, I told myself. One day of kindness doesn't commit me to every morning for the next year. But even as I walked into the hospital, a small, nagging doubt crept in. How many times would today turn into tomorrow? How many mornings would I need to negotiate my comfort, my time, my very mental space? And silently, I wondered how quickly this single act of politeness would ripple through the eyes of everyone else in the hospital. Little did I know. That first ride, the simple yes, was the start of a chain of events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about kindness, boundaries, and patience. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, the anticipation of another long drive weighing on me in a way I hadn't expected. The sky was still dark, and the air had a crisp bite to it that made me shiver as I opened the apartment door. I could already feel the tension in my shoulders before even seeing him. As I stepped outside, I saw him standing there, backpack slung over one shoulder, fumbling slightly with his coffee cup. "Morning," he said, his smile a little forced, like he sensed something had shifted from yesterday. "Morning," I replied, my voice calm but measured. I didn't want to start the day with confrontation, but I needed to set boundaries. As we merged onto the highway, the silence stretched for a few miles before I spoke. "Listen," I said carefully, "I wanted to let you know. I won't be able to give you a ride every day." He turned toward me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Okay, that's fine." His tone didn't match his expression, which was tense and uncertain. I took a deep breath, trying to articulate my reasoning without sounding harsh. "It's not personal. The thing is, our schedules aren't synced. Sometimes I have to leave at 5, sometimes 6. The departments we're assigned to don't always end at the same time. And I really value my morning time. It's the only quiet time I have to listen to audiobooks or call family. I don't want to feel pressured every day to coordinate or send constant messages asking, "Are you ready yet?" He nodded slowly, but the subtle frown betrayed the tension in his mind. "I understand," he said, though the corners of his mouth didn't reach his eyes. "You don't have to wait for me, just whenever it's convenient for you." The rest of the drive was quieter than yesterday. The audiobook played softly in the background, but I couldn't focus. Every mile felt like a negotiation in my mind. How much kindness is too much? How much is enough before politeness becomes burden? When we reached the hospital, he thanked me again, but his tone was different this time, less sincere, almost reluctant. I nodded and walked away, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. I could sense that the challenge had only just begun. What had seemed like a small, polite gesture was already beginning to strain the delicate balance of my personal time and professional responsibility. The thought that tomorrow could bring another similar confrontation weighed heavily on me. The days following that second ride felt heavier than I could have anticipated. Each morning, waking up to the thought of the long drive felt like lifting a weight I hadn't noticed before. The simple, quiet ritual I had relied upon, the solitude of the car, the familiarity of the road, the comfort of the audiobook, was now tinged with a strange tension. I wondered if he was already waiting outside, silently judging how long it took me to finish breakfast or whether I would leave exactly on time. It wasn't that he said much. In fact, he often stayed quiet during the drive, scrolling through his phone or staring out the window at the passing fields. But the presence itself was enough to make me hyper-aware of every word I said, every action I took, and the exact pace at which I drove. I found myself calculating, if I took the scenic route, would he feel anxious about being late? If I paused at the traffic light, would it feel like an inconvenience to him? At work, things didn't get easier. The hospital, small and rural, was a place where word traveled fast. One of the senior residents, noticing the slight tension between me and the new intern, leaned in one day. "You're a bit cold, aren't you?" she asked with a smirk. I tried to smile politely, unsure what she meant. Later, whispers reached me. "She doesn't want to help him. She's so selfish." The weight of these words, though subtle, pressed on me like the humidity on a summer morning. I questioned myself. Was I really being selfish? Was I wrong for valuing my own time, my own mental space, for preserving the small sanctuary of my mornings? Every glance, every whispered comment felt magnified, echoing through the quiet hallways of the hospital. And then, the intern would make small comments during the ride home, almost like tiny tests. "I don't want to inconvenience you," he would say, tone polite, eyes darting to mine, watching for my reaction. I could sense the growing frustration in him, the internal conflict he must be feeling, dependent on me for transportation yet aware of the tension between us. I felt a pang of empathy, but it did little to alleviate the constant pressure of accommodating someone else's schedule in addition to my own. The tension became a strange dance of politeness and resistance, each of us negotiating unspoken boundaries. I wanted to be kind, to help, to maintain professional harmony, but I also felt the creeping suffocation of losing control over a part of my life that was supposed to be mine. Every morning became a rehearsal of patience, a subtle struggle that no one else could see, a battle that existed entirely in the quiet compartments of my mind. One particularly long day, after a morning filled with patient rounds, procedures, and administrative chaos, I found myself walking to the parking lot, exhausted, only to see him standing by my car, backpack slung over one shoulder, coffee in hand. The smile he offered this time was less genuine, more expectant. I took a deep breath. "I'm going to leave as soon as I'm ready," I said firmly, trying to convey my boundaries without confrontation. He nodded, but didn't hide the disappointment. The drive back was silent. He stared out the window, occasionally letting out a small sigh. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, feeling the tension coil tighter with every mile. My audiobook played softly, but my mind couldn't focus. Thoughts spun in a dizzying loop. Am I wrong for prioritizing myself? Am I letting politeness trap me in someone else's needs? As we pulled into his apartment complex, he muttered a quick thanks, and I responded with a neutral nod. I sat in my car for a moment longer, exhaling slowly, trying to reclaim a fragment of the calm I had before he arrived. It was in this moment, alone again, that I realized something fundamental. My desire to be polite, to avoid confrontation, had been quietly eroding my autonomy. Over the next few days, the pattern became unmistakable. Every time I agreed to give him a ride, there was a subtle expectation he carried with him, a reliance that wasn't spoken but felt in every glance, every word. I was caught between kindness and control, empathy and self-preservation. The social pressure from other colleagues, the whispers and half-smiles, only amplified the internal conflict. I began to understand that no one else could dictate my boundaries, and that setting them wasn't cruelty, it was necessary. By the end of the first week, I had begun to form a quiet plan. I would remain courteous, yes, but assertive. I would be honest about my availability, about my needs, about the limits of my patience. It was a lesson in self-respect, in understanding that politeness was a choice, not a duty, and that even small acts of kindness carried consequences. I had to navigate carefully. The second week of residency began much like the first: early mornings, the crisp chill of pre-dawn air, and the rhythmic hum of the engine as I started the drive to the hospital. But something had shifted. I could feel it even before I stepped outside. The quiet tension, the unspoken negotiation that had begun to define every morning. As I opened the door, there he was, backpack slung over one shoulder, fumbling with his coffee cup. "Morning," he said, a hint of awkwardness in his voice that hadn't been there the first day. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I had made it clear yesterday that I couldn't give him a ride every day, but the fact that he still expected me to drive him felt heavy. The car, which had once been my sanctuary, my private space for audiobooks and reflection, now felt like a stage for silent negotiation. We merged onto the highway, the usual stretches of fields and clusters of trees scrolling past like scenery in a movie I didn't choose. I could feel his eyes on me every now and then, subtle glances that suggested both hope and expectation. I resisted the urge to glance at the rearview mirror too often, focusing instead on the road ahead. "Listen," I started, carefully choosing my words. "I want to make something clear. I can give you rides sometimes, but not every day. My schedule isn't consistent. Some mornings I have to leave at 5, sometimes 6. The departments we're in don't end at the same time, and I value my drive. It's the only quiet time I get before work." He nodded, a forced smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I get it," he said. But there was a subtle edge to his voice, a tension beneath the surface that spoke volumes. He was disappointed, frustrated even, though he tried to mask it. The drive continued in silence. I let the audiobook play softly, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about the upcoming week: patient rounds, rotations, the long stretches of standing on my feet, the exhaustion that had already begun to creep into my muscles. And now, on top of it all, the subtle pressure of someone else's reliance on me. It was a lot for a first-year resident to process. Arriving at the hospital, I parked the car and exhaled. He thanked me, as always, and I nodded, walking toward the entrance with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The halls of the hospital were bustling, nurses and interns moving briskly, the beeping of monitors, the distant chatter of patients and doctors blending into a kind of symphony I had learned to navigate. But I could feel it: the subtle whispers, the curious glances from other residents, the unspoken judgment. By midday, I could feel the tension building again. My mentor had assigned me to a patient with a complex case. As I moved through the wards, I noticed him waiting near the nurse's station, asking small questions of anyone who would listen. His presence was benign in itself, but I could feel it like an invisible weight pressing against my own focus. Lunch brought a small reprieve, a quiet moment alone in the cafeteria with a sandwich and my notes. I could hear him chatting with another intern at a nearby table, laughing too loudly, as if to assert a sense of entitlement to my time. My chest tightened. I reminded myself, it's not your fault he can't drive himself. You're allowed to have boundaries. The afternoon rotations were exhausting, physically and emotionally. I barely noticed the hours passing, my focus entirely on patients, procedures, and learning the ins and outs of the hospital. But when the day ended, and we returned to the parking lot, the weight returned. He was there, waiting. My sanctuary. The car was no longer mine alone. Driving home, I felt the creeping tension in the air. Every red light, every pause, every turn seemed to magnify the unspoken conversation between us. I thought about the whispers I had overheard earlier in the week, comments from other interns about my selfishness and lack of willingness to help. Each one pricked at me like a needle. small but persistent, planting doubts I didn't want to feel. I realized then that this was no longer just about giving rides. It was about control, autonomy, and the subtle ways in which social pressure could infiltrate even the smallest acts of kindness. I needed a strategy, a way to assert my boundaries without creating a confrontation. To remain polite but firm, empathetic but unwavering. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt drained in a way that was new, unfamiliar. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. The weight of negotiating kindness, politeness, and personal space all at once. I parked, opened the door, and sat inside, trying to reclaim a sense of peace. I knew the next day would bring the same drive, the same subtle tension, and I needed to be ready. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the sun dip behind the buildings. The world outside continued in its quiet rhythm, indifferent to the internal struggles of a first-year resident. And I realized this was the first real test of my patience, of my ability to maintain my personal boundaries in the face of subtle social pressure, and the start of a journey that would teach me more about myself than I could have anticipated. The morning sun had barely begun to peek over the horizon when I rolled out of bed, already feeling the weight of the day ahead pressing against my chest. I had mapped every detail in my mind, tried to rehearse the mental resilience I would need, but nothing could fully prepare me for what was coming. Stepping outside, I spotted him again, waiting as if this was routine, his coffee in hand, and a faint, polite smile plastered across his face. The air was cold, sharp, carrying the scent of wet asphalt from an early rain. I sighed, forcing a tight-lipped smile, and climbed into the car. The engine roared to life, and the familiar hum offered a small comfort, though tension coiled like a snake around my ribs. "Morning," he said, as if nothing had shifted between us. "Morning," I replied curtly, trying to keep my boundaries intact. I had already made it clear I could not give him rides every day, yet the expectation lingered like a shadow. The drive started quietly, the audiobook humming softly in the background, but the silence was heavy, dense with unspoken questions, subtle resentments, and the constant, suffocating pressure of social expectation. Every glance he threw in my direction felt loaded, each one a reminder that he depended on me, that his comfort rested on my willingness to accommodate him. As we approached a red light, he turned slightly in his seat. "I really appreciate this. I mean, I know it's a lot to ask." His tone carried both gratitude and subtle frustration, a dangerous combination I was learning to navigate. I nodded, offering a noncommittal smile, but inside, I felt my patience fraying. By the time we reached the hospital, my muscles were taut, my mind exhausted. But the day had only just begun. Inside, the hospital was alive with the rhythm of organized chaos. Nurses moved briskly, patients murmured, monitors beeped, and doctors hurried through the halls with a practiced efficiency that left no room for hesitation. It was during rounds that the first real confrontation came. One of the senior residents, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, pulled me aside. "You're really strict with him, aren't you?" she said, leaning close enough that her perfume mixed with the sterile hospital air. "You don't want to help him. You're difficult." I froze, unsure whether to respond with defense or a smile. I'm just managing my schedule," I said cautiously. She smirked knowingly. "Well, some people call it selfishness." The words stung more than I expected. I had not considered that my choice to protect my time, my drive, my sanctuary could be judged so openly. Every polite refusal, every assertion of my boundaries, now felt scrutinized, amplified by whispers in the hallways and sideways glances from colleagues. During the afternoon rotations, the tension only grew. He lingered near the nurse's station, asking quiet questions, occasionally glancing at me, eyes flicking up as if testing how far he could push. Each glance, each casual question, each subtle complaint chipped at my composure, eroding the mental space I had fought so hard to maintain. On the drive home, the situation escalated. Traffic was heavier than usual, a slow crawl that heightened every irritant. He shifted in his seat, sighing occasionally, his voice low and hesitant. "I hope I'm not making this too difficult." I could feel my jaw tighten. "You're not being difficult. You're just expecting too much." I didn't say it aloud. Politeness was still necessary. I had to navigate the situation delicately, balancing my need for personal space with his expectations. By the time we reached his apartment, the tension had reached a point that was almost tangible. He offered a quiet thanks, but the words were hollow, carrying the weight of unspoken frustration. I nodded, stepping out of the car, and exhaled deeply, letting the door shut behind me as if sealing away the strain. I realized in that moment that this was more than just a transportation issue. It had become a test of endurance, a battle between empathy and self-preservation, a subtle struggle to maintain control over the one space I had claimed as mine. Back in my apartment, I sank into a chair, tea in hand, staring out the window at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. I reflected on the day, the tension, the judgment from colleagues, and the expectations of the intern. It was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, yet necessary. I needed to define my limits clearly, assert my boundaries, and learn to maintain my autonomy even if it meant discomfort and temporary social friction. This was the first real lesson of residency, that kindness was not a duty, that politeness could be misinterpreted, and that protecting one's own space and time was not selfish, it was survival. The following morning arrived like a storm I could feel before seeing it. I woke up to a chill in the air and the subtle hum of anxiety in my chest. The drive was already weighing heavily on me. The anticipation of his presence had become a mental hurdle almost as exhausting as the work at the hospital. As I stepped outside, he was already there, waiting as if this was his right, coffee in hand. The polite smile he offered this time felt rehearsed, forced. I took a deep breath, silently reminding myself to remain calm. Polite yet firm. "Morning," he said, tone light but with a weight beneath it, the unspoken expectation heavy in the air. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady but neutral. I could feel my jaw tighten. The car, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The drive began quietly. The audiobook played softly, but my attention was fractured, constantly scanning for subtle cues of his mood. Every glance, every movement, every small comment became a tiny test. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said after a long silence. His voice was polite, but there was an edge of frustration that hadn't been there before. "You're not," I replied carefully. "But remember, I can't do this every day. I need my mornings. My schedule is unpredictable, and I really need to preserve some time for myself." He nodded, but I could see it in his eyes, disappointment, a flicker of resentment, subtle but undeniable. The tension between us was like static in the air, invisible, but present in every movement. The hospital, whispers followed me. The other interns and residents, always observing, had begun to form opinions. "She's so selfish," one said under her breath as I passed. Another cast a sidelong glance, smirking. Even casual observers could sense the strain between us, though none fully understood its source. During rounds, I felt the weight of every look, every sideways comment, every quiet judgment. The intern lingered near the nurse's station, asking small, seemingly innocent questions, but each one felt like a probe, a test of my patience. I caught myself holding my breath, my mind replaying scenarios, calculating the best way to maintain professionalism without conceding my own boundaries. The drive home was unbearable. Traffic crawled slowly, and every stoplight, every slight delay became amplified. He sighed repeatedly, shifting in his seat, and I could feel my own frustration growing in response. I reminded myself, kindness is not obligation. Politeness is not duty. I had to maintain control of my time and mental space. When we finally reached his apartment, the tension had built to a point where words were nearly unnecessary. He muttered a quiet thanks, but it carried a tone of subtle reproach, the kind that makes you question your motives despite knowing you're right. I nodded, stepping out of the car and closing the door gently. I could feel the weight of the day, the strain of social judgment, and the burden of unspoken expectations pressing against me. Sitting alone in my car afterward, I realized something fundamental. This wasn't about the ride. This was a lesson in boundaries, in self-respect, and in the subtle ways social pressure can infiltrate even the most mundane aspects of life. I had to remain firm, yet kind. I had to assert myself without creating unnecessary confrontation. And perhaps most importantly, I had to remember that my autonomy was not negotiable. The next few days passed with a similar rhythm: early mornings, silent tension, subtle glances, and small moments of conflict that wore down my patience like water slowly eroding stone. I began to notice patterns: the way he waited, the way his expectations subtly tested me, the way whispers and sideways glances from colleagues amplified the stress. One afternoon, After particularly grueling rotations, I found myself in the hospital parking lot, staring at my car with a mix of dread and resolve. He approached, backpack slung casually over one shoulder, coffee in hand, and offered a small, polite smile. "Ready?" he asked. I hesitated, took a deep breath, and said firmly, "I can drive you today, but I need to be clear. I can't make this a daily thing. My schedule is unpredictable, and I need my time alone to recharge." He nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face, though disappointment lingered. The drive began quietly, the tension palpable but manageable. I focused on the road, on the rhythm of the tires against asphalt, on the audiobook, playing softly in the background, and allowed myself a small sense of control, returning, over the next week. I maintained this balance, courteous but firm, empathetic but assertive. I set clear expectations, communicated openly, and did not allow social pressure or subtle judgment to dictate my choices. Slowly, the tension between us began to ease. He learned the boundaries, and I learned the value of protecting my own time and mental space. By the end of the second week, I reflected on what had occurred. That initial act of politeness, the simple yes to a ride, had spiraled into weeks of subtle conflict, social judgment, and personal strain. But it had also taught me something invaluable. Kindness does not mean self-sacrifice, politeness does not mean submission. And boundaries are not cruelty, they are self-respect. As I sat alone in my apartment that evening, tea in hand, I realized that residency was not only a test of medical skill, but a profound lesson in personal resilience, emotional intelligence, and the delicate art of navigating human relationships. My mornings, once threatened by obligation and expectation, were reclaimed. My boundaries, once tested and stretched, were solidified. And I knew that, moving forward, I could approach challenges with clarity, empathy, and the unwavering understanding that my autonomy mattered just as much as anyone else's. The third week began with a rhythm I had begun to recognize. Early mornings, a long drive through winding country roads, and the silent anticipation of seeing him waiting for a ride. I had grown accustomed to asserting boundaries. Yet the first moments outside my apartment still carried that flutter of unease. "Morning," he said, coffee in hand, backpack slung casually, the usual mix of gratitude and expectation lingering in his voice. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I had learned to reserve judgment, to maintain professionalism while guarding my personal space. The drive itself had become a test of focus and patience. Traffic was light, the audiobook narrating softly in the background, but I could feel his occasional glances, subtle questions, small sighs that reminded me of the constant negotiation we performed silently every day. At the hospital, the challenges multiplied. Complex patient cases, rotating supervisors, and the ever-present expectation to be both efficient and empathetic pushed me to my limits. Each day demanded more than medical skill, it demanded diplomacy, observation, and emotional resilience. During rounds, I noticed colleagues whispering again, subtle glances, small judgments that carried weight in ways outsiders might not recognize. Yet I refused to let these external pressures dictate my mood or my boundaries. I realized the key was not to react but to observe, to remain professional, and to trust my judgment. By midweek, tension surfaced in new ways. The intern began testing boundaries, asking questions about schedules, subtly implying reliance on me beyond what was reasonable. "Do you usually leave this early?" he asked one morning, the tone casual but probing. "Yes, my schedule is variable," I replied. "Sometimes I have procedures that start early. Other days, I may need extra time to prepare." He nodded, a faint frown crossing his face, and I could sense the disappointment. It was subtle, yet it resonated more loudly than words ever could. Colleagues also began to weigh in, observing our interactions, some casting judgment while others remained silent. It was a delicate balance of social navigation, being helpful without overextending, polite without compromising, empathetic without submitting. Each interaction was a lesson. I realized that residency wasn't just about medical knowledge, it was about learning how to assert oneself in a professional environment, to recognize subtle cues, and to maintain integrity while navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. By the end of the week, fatigue set in. Physically, my legs and back ached from long hours standing and moving between wards. Mentally, the constant negotiation between kindness, autonomy, and professional expectation weighed heavily. Driving home one evening, the tension in the car was nearly tangible. He was quiet, but the subtle frustration lingered. I felt the same exhaustion mirrored in his posture, his glances, and the way he fiddled with his bag. "Thanks for the ride," he said softly, but it carried the weight of unspoken frustration. I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. My mind replayed the week, the whispers, the subtle judgments, the tiny tests of patience. I realized that exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The negotiation of space, boundaries, and politeness required as much energy as the hospital work itself. Yet, despite the strain, I felt a growing sense of mastery. I had learned to recognize when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to maintain a personal balance even amidst external pressures. It was a subtle victory, one that wouldn't be visible to anyone else, but it mattered deeply. By the end of the third week, patterns had emerged. The intern had begun to understand my boundaries, subtly adjusting his expectations. Colleagues' whispers carried less weight as I internalized the principle that my own autonomy and time were non-negotiable. I began to notice a sense of calm return during my drive, my sanctuary slowly reclaimed. The audiobook, once interrupted by tension, now filled the car with a comforting background. The road became a space not of negotiation but of reflection, a time to process the day, decompress, and prepare for the next. Residency had become more than just medical training. It had become a lesson in empathy, resilience, and personal boundaries. I had learned that being polite did not mean surrendering control, that kindness did not require self-sacrifice, and that maintaining one's mental and emotional space was not selfish, it was necessary for survival and growth. By reflecting on these challenges, I realized that each difficult interaction, each subtle conflict, each test of patience, was a stepping stone. I was not just learning to navigate the hospital or to treat patients effectively, I was learning to navigate life, relationships, and the complexities of human expectation while remaining true to myself. That Thursday morning, the air was unusually heavy, the sky a muted gray, signaling another day that would test both patience and resolve. I stepped outside, expecting him to be waiting, and unsurprisingly he was. Backpack slung casually, coffee in hand, his polite smile masking the subtle tension that had grown between us. "Morning," he said, the tone measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of expectation. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady. The car, once my sanctuary, now felt like a stage, a place where every glance and every word mattered more than the road ahead. The drive began silently, the audiobook humming softly, but every mile felt heavier than usual, each stoplight a reminder that time itself was under scrutiny. I could sense him observing, waiting for cues, testing the limits of my patience without ever voicing it directly. "You don't mind the early hours, do you?" he asked quietly, almost as if testing me. "I manage," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But remember, I can't do this every day." His nod was polite but faintly disappointed. I felt the subtle coil of tension tighten in my chest, an invisible, almost physical weight that would accompany every mile of the drive. PAN for B hospital chaos. Stress intensifies inside the hospital. The chaos of rotations and patient care compounded the stress. Complex cases, overlapping schedules, and critical procedures pushed me to my limits. Each task demanded precision, empathy, and endurance, leaving little mental energy for interpersonal tensions, but those tensions had a way of finding me anyway. The intern lingered near the nurse's station again. Small comments, subtle questions, casual observations that carried weight far beyond their apparent innocuousness. Colleagues whispered in passing, glancing with subtle judgment. Every look, every word, every minor expression felt amplified. During rounds, I found myself simultaneously managing patients, observing the dynamic between us, and carefully navigating the expectations and judgments of others. The tension was no longer a minor annoyance, it had become a constant mental background hum, draining energy with every interaction. That evening, the drive home became the true test. Traffic snarled, rain slicked the roads, and the usual calm of the drive was replaced with a palpable tension. He sighed repeatedly, the sound low but unmistakable. I resisted the urge to snap, keeping my focus on the road while simultaneously processing the emotional weight pressing down on me. "Are you in a hurry?" he asked, carefully neutral, but with a subtle edge. "I have commitments," I replied firmly. "I need to leave when I need to leave. I've explained this before." His silence was telling. The weight of expectation, frustration, and perhaps disappointment hung in the air like fog. I felt the clash of empathy and self-preservation rise to the surface, a battle between wanting to help and needing to maintain my autonomy. By the time we arrived at his apartment, the strain had reached its peak. He muttered a quiet thanks, but I could sense the tension still lingering. Exiting the car, I exhaled, the storm of the day finally settling, but only partially. The internal conflict had not vanished. It had transformed into clarity. I would maintain my boundaries, yes, but I would do so with calm and deliberate confidence. Sitting alone later that evening, I reflected on the day. Each interaction, each subtle test of patience, had been a lesson in emotional intelligence, resilience, and personal boundaries. I realized that kindness does not require surrendering one's own autonomy, and politeness does not obligate endless accommodation. I began to see a pattern emerge: the intern's reliance, the judgments of colleagues, and the tension of the morning drive were all part of a learning curve, not just medically, but personally. The real skill was not only in performing duties efficiently but in navigating human expectations, maintaining integrity, and preserving one's mental and emotional space. By reclaiming control of my schedule, setting firm but polite boundaries, and reflecting on my own needs, I regained a sense of empowerment. The road, once a stage for negotiation, became a space for reflection. The car, once a cage of expectation, transformed back into a sanctuary where I could decompress, think, and prepare for the next challenge. In the end, that week taught me that the true measure of strength was not only in clinical skill but in the ability to navigate life with clarity, empathy, and unwavering self-respect. I had learned to maintain balance, to assert boundaries, and to recognize that protecting my own time and emotional space was not selfish, it was essential. Monday morning arrived with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The early sunlight filtered softly through my apartment blinds, casting a warm glow across the room. I had woken up with a sense of clarity, a subtle but undeniable shift in perspective. The weight of tension that had haunted each morning drive seemed lighter somehow. Stepping outside, I spotted him waiting, backpack slung over his shoulder, coffee in hand. The polite smile was there, but this time, it carried no expectation, no subtle tension. I returned the smile and climbed into the car, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," I replied, my tone steady. I realized that asserting boundaries did not need to create conflict. It could coexist with kindness and professionalism. The drive was quiet, comfortable even. The audiobook played, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the peace of my morning ritual returning. The road, the hum of the engine, and the rhythm of the tires against asphalt became a space for reflection rather than negotiation. At the hospital, the difference was noticeable. The intern had begun to respect my boundaries. He no longer lingered unnecessarily or tested subtle limits. Instead, he focused on his own responsibilities, quietly observing the routines of the hospital without relying on me as a crutch. Colleagues' whispers and sideways glances had lost their sting. I understood now that I could not control their perceptions, but I could control my reactions. My confidence in asserting boundaries without guilt, my ability to remain courteous yet firm, had grown. I noticed how this self-assurance positively impacted my interactions with patients and staff alike, allowing me to focus on what truly mattered: providing care efficiently, empathetically, and professionally. Driving home that evening, the city lights reflecting on wet asphalt, I reflected on the journey of the past few weeks. The challenge had been more than managing rides or dealing with subtle judgment. It had been about understanding myself, recognizing the limits of empathy, and learning that kindness is not a measure of self-sacrifice. I had discovered that protecting my own time and emotional space was not selfish. It was necessary for mental health, professional growth, and personal balance. I realized that politeness could coexist with firmness, and empathy could be expressed without surrendering autonomy. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not in the hours logged or the procedures performed, but in mastering the art of balancing human expectation with personal boundaries. By the end of the week, a new rhythm had been established. The morning drives were no longer tests of patience, but a familiar, controlled space. The intern had learned to navigate his own schedule without imposing on mine. Colleagues observed the shift with subtle respect, noticing my quiet confidence and professional assertiveness. Sitting alone in the car one evening, the sun setting over the horizon, I felt a sense of empowerment unlike anything before. Residency was teaching me lessons far beyond medicine. It was teaching me about life, about navigating relationships, and about the importance of self-respect. I smiled to myself, audiobook playing softly, knowing that while challenges would continue, I now had the tools to navigate them: clarity, empathy, and the unwavering understanding that my boundaries mattered. The road ahead was still long, unpredictable, and sometimes difficult, but I had reclaimed my sense of control, and with it, my peace.